Welcome to a meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. I'm David Muller, representing Secretary Tesler here. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation if you have one. Please do not unmute or mute yourself. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with the raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. The chair will then call on the participants. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Regine Foley via the chat box at rfoley@ctps.org or call her at 857-702-3704. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in this meeting, please contact Rosine Foley of the MPO staff at rfoley@ctps.org or call her at 857-702-3704. First time on the agenda, as always, is introductions. I'm David Muller. I represent Secretary Jamie Tesler here. Jonathan, please call the roll.
Okay, MassDOT C2. Okay, Mass DOT Highway Division.
John Romano here.
Thank you. MBTA.
Julianne Linnell on behalf of General Manager Steve Poftak.
Massachusetts Port Authority. Okay. Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Eric Barassa with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council.
Thank you. MBTA Advisory Board.
Oh, you're muted, Brian. Somebody unmute Brian. I see him moving. He's here. I can see him.
He
is unmuted, but perhaps he's having an audio issue.
All right. Well, Brian is here. We all see Brian.
Yep.
He's raised.
Yep. I have him logged. Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Undertakings Advisory Council here.
Thank you. City of Boston, Boston Transportation Department.
Phil Conroy here representing the City of Boston on behalf of Mayor Kim Janey.
Thank you. City of Boston, BPDA.
Hey, Jim Fitzgerald with BPDA representing Mayor Janey in the City of Boston.
Thank you. At-large, City of Everett.
Jay Monty representing Mayor DeMaria in the City of Everett.
Thank you. At-large, City of Newton.
Yes, good morning. Jason Sobel here with the City of Newton representing Mayor Fuller.
Thank you. At-large, Town of Arlington.
Daniel Amstutz, Town of Arlington, representing Select Board Chair Steve DeCourcy.
Thank you. At-large, Town of Brookline.
Heather Hamilton for the Town of Brookline.
Intercore Committee, City of Somerville.
Tom Bent, City of Somerville, representing Mayor Joe Curtatone in the Intercore.
Thank you. Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton.
Austin Sagano with the Town of Acton, representing the Magic Subregion.
Thank you. Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Thatcher Keyser representing Mayor Spicer, Metro West.
Thank you. North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
Darlene is just joining the meeting, so we might want to circle back.
All right, I'll come back. North Suburban Planning Council, City of Woburn.
Good morning, Tina Cassidy, representing Woburn Mayor Scott Galvin.
Thank you. I'll go back to North Shore Task Force, City of Beverly.
Darlene Nguyen, representing Mayor Cahill for the North Shore Task Force.
Thank you. South Shore Coalition, Town of Rockland. Okay. Southwest Advisory Planning Committee, Town of Medway.
Peter Pelletier, Town of Medway.
Thank you. And Three Rivers Interlocal Council, Town of Norwood, Neponset River Chamber.
Good morning, Tom O'Rourke from the Town of Norwood, representing the Trick subregion.
Thank you. And then our ex officio members, Federal Highway Administration.
Good morning, Ken Miller, Federal Highway.
And Federal Transit Administration. That calls the roll, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next time on the agenda is the chair's report. Our next meeting is currently scheduled for 2 weeks from today, which I believe is the 16th. That is also Yom Kippur, so we will not be meeting on that day. We would, however, like to meet on the 23rd. So please let staff know if for some reason you cannot make the 23rd, and please let them know by tomorrow or Monday, Monday's a holiday, Tuesday at the latest, because if we don't have a quorum, we will just cancel the meeting. Otherwise, please plan to attend the meeting on the 23rd from 10 to noon. Thanks. Next up is the Executive Director's Report. Tegan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be relatively brief today. I have not too many things to say in terms of announcements. We are still recruiting, and we will be recruiting more staff coming up soon. So just a reminder to folks, please share if you can with appropriate folks that we're recruiting for a project accountant, and we will be soon recruiting to replace our outreach coordinator position, which Kate White recently left. So keep an eye out. Again, I think there might be some more jobs coming up in the future. In addition, today I don't actually have any outreach or public comment highlights other than what will already be covered during the meeting itself. So I'll just say that today we are going to ask you for your vote to endorse the federal fiscal year 2021 UPWP amendment after the 21-day public comment period. So that's the amendment for the current UPWP. And then we will also have an update and discussion on the Community Connections program. And Sandy will talk about some of the successes of the program and some adjustments, some recommended adjustments that we'll make for future funding cycles. And then, as David just mentioned, we intend to hold the next MPO meeting on the 23rd of September. And on that day, the agenda topics will focus on the presentation of the future of the CURB 2 project, updates on how we are looking to engage stakeholders in our process to understand how our modeling tools can give insight into the uncertainties around pandemic and post-pandemic travel behaviors in our forecasting work. So we'll talk a little bit about how we plan to start engaging with you all and other stakeholders on that topic. And then we'll also follow up on the MPO elections survey, the first presentation of which was on August 5th. And so we'll come back with more information and analysis on that survey for you. And that, Mr. Chair, is it for today. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Tegan. Any questions for Tegan from the members? Seeing none, the next item on the agenda is public comments. Does anyone from the public like to make a comment at this time? If so, please raise your hand. Seeing none, if you'd like to comment during the meeting, raise your hand and we will call on you. Next up is committee chairs reports. Are there any? Derek Schuster.
Good morning. After review of Amendment 1 to the FFY 2021 UPWP, the Boston MPO UPWP Committee recommends the MPO endorse the amendment. The committee is also not scheduled to meet again until new business is presented for committee deliberation.
Thank you, Derek. Any questions for Derek? Seeing none, next item on the agenda is the update of the Regional Transportation Advisory Council. Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No comments. We have not had a meeting since our last meeting here. Excuse me. But our next meeting will be on the 8th, being a week from yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Next item is the approval of the MPO minutes from July 15th, 2021. Can I get a motion and a second from a member to approve the minutes, and please state your name for the record? Brian Kane.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Brian.
Hey, I am delighted that to be able to say and be heard to move approval of the minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, I second that motion.
Thank you. Motion having been made and seconded. Any comments, changes, suggestions, or corrections? Seeing none, Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller.
Yes.
Is John Richard come?
Not seeing him.
Not seeing him. Okay. John Romano.
Yes.
Jillian Linnell.
Jillian Linnell, yes.
Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane.
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins.
Leonard Diggins, yes.
Bill Conroy.
Bill Conroy, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald.
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty.
Jay Monty, yes.
Jason Sobel.
Jason Sobel, yes.
Daniel Amstutz.
Daniel Amstutz, I will abstain as I was not at the meeting.
Okay. Heather Hamilton.
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent.
Tom Bent, yes.
Thank you. Austin Saganowitz.
Austin Scanowitz abstains. I was not there as well.
Thatcher Keyser.
Thatcher Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Nguyen.
Darlene Nguyen votes yes.
Tina Cassidy.
Tina Cassidy votes yes.
Until Jennifer Constable is here now. So Jennifer Constable.
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier. Peter. Okay. And Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is the possible approval of the federal fiscal year 2021 UPWP Amendment. Sandy Johnston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. I am here to ask for your endorsement of Amendment 1 to the current federal fiscal year 2021 UPWP. The UPWP committee met this morning to discuss the amendment, and as you heard from Derek Schuster just now, voted to recommend that the MPO endorse it. Just to be very clear, this is the current document that governs the MPO's current budget through the end of September, not the 2022 UPWP that you voted to endorse at your last meeting. The memo accompanying this amendment, which is posted on the meeting calendar, documents changes to the UPWP requested by MPO staff for the fourth quarter of federal fiscal year 2021, reflecting changing needs and staff resources as the year has unfolded. It also contains a minor content modification from MAPC. You may recall that there are a couple of accompanying materials to help explain this amendment. You can refer to any of them, but the table that we are currently showing on the screen is neatest for summarizing the changes concisely. There's the memo that I just mentioned, which explains the process, reasoning, and need behind this amendment. And there's also an updated version of the FFY 2021 UPWP, as it would be if this amendment is endorsed. The MPO voted to release this draft amendment for public comment at its August 5th meeting. The 21-day public comment period closed on Wednesday, August 25th. We received one comment on this amendment from the Conservation Law Foundation. That comment is also posted to the meeting calendar. CLF points out that the amendment reallocates money away from the Transportation Equity Program because staff have not had an opportunity to expend the program funds, and expresses CLF's disappointment at the reallocation despite the significant remaining needs relating to equity in the Boston region. They have received a response from MPO staff, and we are also in the process of engaging with them to discuss these questions. I and other staff are happy to take questions at this time. If you have none, I respectfully request that you endorse this amendment Should you vote to endorse it, it will go to FHWA via MassDOT for a quick review.
Thank you, Sandy. Questions from the members? Seeing none, can I get a motion in a second to approve as presented today? And please state your name for the record. Eric Barassa.
Eric Barassa, I make a motion to approve this amendment to the UPWP as presented today.
Tom Bent.
I'd like to second that motion.
Thank you. Motion having been made and seconded. Jonathan, please call the roll.
David Moeller,
Yes.
John Bouchard,
John Bouchard, yes.
John Romano,
John Romano, yes.
Jillian Linnell,
Jillian Linnell, yes.
Eric Barassa,
Eric Barassa, yes.
Brian Kane,
Brian Kane, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Leonard Higgins, yes.
Bill Conroy,
Bill Conroy, yes.
Jim Fitzgerald,
Jim Fitzgerald, yes.
Jay Monty,
Jay Monty, yes.
Jason Sobel,
Jason Sobel, yes.
Daniel Amstutz,
Danielle Amstutz, yes.
Heather Hamilton,
Heather Hamilton, yes.
Tom Bent,
Tom Bent, yes.
Austin Saganowitz,
Austin Saganowitz, yes.
Patrick Keyser,
Patrick Keyser votes yes.
Darlene Nguyen,
Darlene Nguyen votes yes.
Tina Cassidy,
Tina Cassidy votes yes.
Jennifer Constable,
Jennifer Constable, yes.
Peter Pelletier,
Peter Pelletier, yes.
and Tom O'Rourke.
Tom O'Rourke, yes.
Motion carries unanimous, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next item on the agenda is the Community Connections Program. Oh, I thought it was gonna be all Sandy all the time, but it's Matt Genova and Sandy Johnston. Take it away, guys.
And Matt is going to do most of the talking.
Oh, wow. Go ahead, Matt, when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and sorry for the surprise here.
It's a pleasure surprise, Matt.
I appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. So today I'm here alongside my colleague Sandy Johnston to provide an update on the MPO's Community Connections Program. So I will walk you all through the presentation, and then Sandy will be available at the end of the presentation to help sort of tag team the Q&A at the end. Okay, so here's the ground that we'll cover in today's presentation. I'll start with a refresher on the program itself, and then discuss the main goals for today's dialogue. I'll then review the most recent funding round of the program before walking through a handful of challenges with the program's current structure, as well as some recommendations for addressing those challenges. At the end, I'll highlight the key decisions that we'd like you all to consider today before briefly touching on next steps and then opening things up for discussion. So what exactly are we talking about when we discuss the Community Connections Program? I know it's been several months since the TIP cycle, so it's always a good opportunity for a refresher. Community Connections Program is one of the Boston Region MPO's 6 investment programs, which are the 6 different funding buckets that are established by this body's current long-range transportation plan, Destination 2040. This program funds first and last mile connections and other small non-traditional projects that help promote mobility in the region. This program is funded at $2 million annually in the TIP, with the first round of projects selected last year and the second round of funding allocated in the most recent TIP cycle that ended in June of this year. Eligible applicants for the Community Connections Program include municipalities and regional transit authorities. Nonprofits and transportation management associations are also welcome to apply for funding through the program, as long as they do so in partnership with a municipality or RTA. There are a number of project types that are currently eligible for funding through the program, including automatic vehicle location, bike share stations and bicycle parking, dedicated bus lanes, transportation education programs, MBTA e-ink signs, which are real-time bus arrival signs, parking management systems, new bus or shuttle services, and transit signal priority. So what are the goals for today's conversation? So now that we're 2 years into the program and have some idea of how things are working, our goal for today is really to determine the future of the Community Connections program. This includes discussing both the types of projects that are funded, as well as the approach to administering these projects to make them happen. Before we proceed any further, I do want to emphasize that any decisions that are made on the future of the program will not impact projects that have already been selected for funding under the Community Connections banner. Decisions today will only impact future funding rounds. So speaking of past funding rounds, I want to briefly recap the most recent project selection cycle, the results of which were formally endorsed by this board in June of this year. So without going into too much detail on the timeline, I'll highlight here that the application cycle for the Community Connections program is more or less identical to that of the larger TIP process. Projects apply for funding in October through December, with projects scored by MPO staff in December and January. Proponents are offered the opportunity to review their scores in February, and then these scores are presented alongside those of other TIP projects under consideration by the MPO during our annual programming conversations in February, March, and April. In the most recent funding cycle, we had 17 projects apply for funding. 13 of these projects were new applicants, and 4 of these projects were returning applicants from the first round of funding. As you can see on the slide here, the plurality of applicants, 7 out of 17, were transit operating projects like shuttles and microtransit service. We had 4 bike share and bike parking applications, 2 applications each for transit signal priority and transportation education projects, and then 1 applicant each for parking management and wayfinding projects. Because we're dealing with a relatively small program allocation of $2 million a year, however, it's a little bit more illuminating to see these same projects expressed by their funding requests. So even though only 41% of applicants were transit operating projects, those same 7 projects represented 64% of the total funding request for this cycle. Every other project type here is underrepresented in terms of the amount of funding requested relative to the number of projects applying within each category. So the upshot here is that transit operating projects tend to be a little bit more expensive than other types of community connections applications. This isn't a good or bad thing, but rather just something to be conscious of as we consider the overall mix of projects that are eligible for funding through this program. From those 17 applicants this past year, 10 projects were selected for funding in federal fiscal year 2022. Those projects are listed here on the slide, arranged from highest to lowest score. So as you can see here, this board elected to allocate the full $2 million dedicated to this program in fiscal 2022. This also included future year funding for both of the transit operating projects that were selected. This means that a portion of the program's funding in fiscal years 2023 and 24 have already been allocated, though as a reminder that these projects won't be eligible to receive those funds until they show a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions as a result of their operations during their first year of funding. This is a condition of the Federal Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality, or CMAQ funds, that are used to support the program. With 10 projects selected for funding last year, that leaves 7 other projects unfunded. As you can see on this slide here, 6 of the 7 unfunded projects were projects that had 3-year funding requests. During TIP programming conversations earlier this year, this board prioritized funding a larger number of lower cost projects and retaining significant funding flexibility in future fiscal years, which led to these higher cost multi-year projects not being selected relative to their peers. One of the things that we'll want to talk about today is the extent to which this board wants to maintain those priorities, again, on funding flexibility and funding more projects going forward, and whether or not those priorities impact the way that we think about funding operating projects in future TIP cycles. That's something we'll come back to in here in just a minute. So with all that background, I want to dive now into some of the challenges that have arisen with the program through its first two funding rounds, and these two funding rounds have really sort of functioned as an extended pilot as the program has been rolled out. So from that pilot, we've learned that current challenges for the program fall into two main categories: general administrative hurdles and the demands that transit operating projects specifically place on the program. Beginning with the administrative hurdles, the way the program is set up now is that each proposal is treated as a unique project, meaning that each project receives its own administrative contract. This places a heavy administrative burden on staff to manage the contracting paperwork directly with each proponent for each of the 14 projects currently funded through the program. Right now, this burden falls most directly on MassDOT staff in the Office of Transportation Planning. We've explored shifting some of this contracting work to MPO staff, but across both agencies, there's limited bandwidth for staff to take on several hundred hours over the course of a year of new obligations to manage contracts for all of these projects. Transit operating projects also have their own administrative challenges over and above those of capital projects, as these operating projects require more month-to-month engagement with project proponents. These projects also require additional year-end analysis to determine whether or not they've achieved a net greenhouse gas reduction before they're eligible for their next year of funding. Again, that's a requirement of the CMAQ funds that are used for this program and that allow us to fund operating projects. So as we discussed on an earlier slide, funding operating projects across multiple years can also limit the amount of remaining funding within the program for smaller capital projects going forward. This reduces the program's ability to function as a flexible near-term funding source for small projects across the region. Aside from these two challenges, there are also some improvements that can be made to the application process for the Community Connections program. The application is currently fairly rigorous, which can make applying to the program a greater challenge for proponents. So simplifying the application process would lower some of the barriers to entry for the program, bringing the application process more in line with the goal of the program to function as a relatively nimble funding source when compared to the larger TIP process. So how do we address some of these challenges? Our recommended program improvements fall into three categories. First, we'll propose some ways to streamline the current application process. Second, we'll propose some strategies for simplifying the administration of capital projects funded through the Community Connections program. And third, we'll discuss some possible paths forward for considering transit operating projects through this program. So I'll walk through each of these individually. Before I do that, however, I do want to emphasize that these recommendations on the following slides are the result of extensive consultation between MPO staff, MAPC staff, and staff in MassDOT's Office of Transportation Planning. All three parties have discussed the existing program at length, and so what follows in the coming slides are some mutually agreed upon strategies for making the Community Connections program successful and sustainable in the long run. Beginning with our first recommendation, which is to streamline the application process for the Community Connections program. This would involve shortening the current 17-page application into something that is a little bit more manageable for project proponents. This would also involve further clarifying the list of project types that are eligible for funding through the program, which is a subject that I'll come back to on the next slide. I want to note that the remainder of the scoring and selection process would remain as it is today, with the MPO reviewing all applications simultaneously and selecting projects for funding from there. The main benefit of streamlining the application process is that the program burden for both proponents and MPO staff are reduced, as the applications become both easier to submit and easier to review. This supports the program in receiving a wide variety of application types from municipalities across the region, something that we hope to continue to see in the coming years as the program matures. Our second recommendation is to simplify project administration for capital projects funded through the Community Connections program. Again, right now, each project is treated as its own unique entity with its own contracting and procurement process. This adjustment would move the program to a collective purchasing model, where MAPC would conduct a joint procurement for all capital items approved through the program each year. This procurement would take place through MAPC vendor contracts that have already been pre-approved as meeting the requirements for federal funding. And because these procurements would already be established, that would allow the program to better define the materials eligible for purchase. So going back to the previous slide on simplifying the application process, this essentially allows proponents to just tell us what it is they would like to purchase and how they would like to use those items, with MPO staff then scoring projects based on those details. For example, a municipality could say, we want to install X type of pre-approved bike racks at these locations, and another might say we want to install Y type of pre-approved transit signals at these intersections. And then a joint procurement would be done for bike racks and transit signals once those projects are selected for funding by this board. This change would greatly reduce the administrative burden of the program on all parties and would more or less eliminate any questions about project eligibility for federal funding. Again, because those contracts, the joint procurement contracts, would already have been approved to meet federal requirements. This change could also introduce some extra flexibility into the project selection timeline. So right now, because all projects are treated individually, each project must be reviewed by our federal partners as part of the larger TIP. If we were to move to a collective purchasing model, the program as a whole would already have federal approval, and so individual projects would not have to be selected for inclusion in the TIP by our normal early April deadline for all projects. This could allow the MPO more time to consider and select these projects, possibly into the late spring or early summer of each fiscal year. And so there really may or may not be a desire by this board to change the timeline for the program, but it's a possibility that we at least wanted to raise as a part of today's discussion. So as we look to implement a collective purchasing approach to the Community Connections program, MPO staff are working with MAPC to understand what other types of projects may help meet the needs of municipalities in the region, while also being a good fit for joint procurement. In addition to the capital projects already funded through the program, which I touched on earlier, staff are exploring adding bus stop improvements, bicycle signals, and right-of-way markers like jersey barriers and bollards to the possible procurement list. In addition to these and the types of projects that we already fund, we're also more than happy to hear other ideas that you might have for project types that would be useful to fund through the program. So please feel free to bring those into the discussion here in a few minutes, or feel free to sort of think about that and follow up with staff at a later date. Our third and final recommendation is to consider adjusting how the Community Connections program funds transit operating projects. There are really two options here. The first is to require that shuttle and microtransit projects be administered directly by regional transit authorities. So in this situation, the RTA would be the project proponent, perhaps in partnership with a municipality or other organization. This means that the federal highway CMAQ funds that are used to support these projects would be flexed to the Federal Transit Administration, with FTA working directly with the proponent RTA on project oversight. This option greatly reduces the administrative burden for transit operating projects on MassDOT and MPO staff, as project administration work would be shifted into a workflow that's already happening between FTA and the RTAs. Option number two is to remove transit operating projects from the list of eligible projects funded through the Community Connections program. This would clearly reduce the administrative burden of these projects for all parties, and would also allow the program to retain greater financial flexibility year to year, as there would be few, if any, multi-year projects funded. If operating projects are no longer funded, there may also be potential to explore shifting funding for this program from federal CMAQ dollars to another federal source, which could eliminate the need to conduct individual greenhouse gas analyses for each project as a part of the application and eligibility determination process. So your feedback is especially important on this topic, as changing our approach to operating projects could represent a shift of this program away from its initial vision as a source of funding for shuttle and microtransit projects. So we especially invite your feedback on this as we get into the discussion here in just a few minutes. So now that I've covered those recommendations, I want to sort of refocus on the decisions that we're asking you to consider today. First, does this board support the proposed adjustments to the Community Connections program for future funding rounds when it comes to both simplifying the application process and revising our approach to project administration? And second, does this board want to find a way to continue to fund transit operating projects going forward And if so, should these exclusively be administered by regional transit authorities? So before we get to those questions, I want to briefly highlight where we're heading in the coming months with respect to the Community Connections program. So believe it or not, federal fiscal year 2022 starts in just under a month on October 1st. With the start of a new fiscal year, we'll begin to gear up for this year's funding round, including finalizing any adjustments to the application and scoring process. Like last year, we'll aim for late October or early November to formally release the application, giving project proponents roughly 6 weeks to submit. By early to mid-December, all final project proposals will be due, and MPO staff will begin the project scoring process from there. So all of this is to say that now is a great time to make any decisions on the scope or mechanics of the Community Connections program, as this allows staff plenty of time to implement those changes and communicate with potential project proponents before the next tip cycle begins in earnest. So with that, I will stop there and turn it back over to the chair for a discussion. And again, my colleague Sandy Johnson is here to help facilitate that.
So Matt, can you put your 2 questions back up so we can have our discussion? Thank you. MPO members, anyone want to discuss either of these points or anything else that Matt has covered? Please raise your hand if so. Daniel Amstutz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have a few questions, but I'll start with the second part of this. One question or thought that came to mind: is there any benefit for the transit operating projects? Is there any benefit to limiting the number of those projects in any given year to say like 2? Like, would that reduce the administrative burden in any appreciable way? And then secondly, what is there has the second option about the RTAs being being the administrative link here, like are they open to that? Would they be interested in that? So I'm curious about their thoughts, or if you've talked to them.
Ed or Sandy?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. So we have not yet had a chance to vet this with all the RTAs. Obviously, that would be the next step if the board would like us to explore that. One of the RTAs, Mart, did apply for a transit operating project last year that was not funded. In terms of the flexibility, one of the things that we have talked about at different points with this program is trying to put caps on or implementing kind of a categorization of what percentage of each funds we might want to expend on a particular category of project each year. And we could, in theory, the board could, in theory, direct us to explore just funding 1 or 2 transit operating projects each year to cap that administrative complexity. I think from our perspective, as we understand it, as MPO staff, really, if the operating projects are going to be administered through FTA, then how many of them there are doesn't make a huge amount of difference to us. The impact is more to flexibility within the funding structure of the program in future years. But I guess what I would say is it's more of a question of how much of the program do you want to be taken up by those operating projects than a question of administrative complexity if it's going to be funded through the RTAs. Matt, I don't know if you have anything else you want to say about that.
No, I think you covered the main points there pretty well. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think I understood that. I'll just go to my comment or thought about the first one, the first part of this, or it's more of a question about this the collective procurement. I think so. From what I gathered is you saying that for each sort of round of projects that MAPC would do a collective procurement sort of specifically for those projects, so that they're all sort of captured within a single collective procurement, and that all of the different pieces or implementation parts would be underneath that?
I see Eric has his hand up, but I'll just speak to that briefly. The idea would be to create a collective procurement for each category of projects. We define the list of types of things, the objects that a municipality or whomever else can procure, and then we would try and figure out how many there's a demand for, and then MAPC would write a contract.
Eric?
Yeah, what we've discussed is to, basically ahead of time canvas, what is it that municipalities feel would be really critical for these connections, then do the procurement, have all of that kind of ahead of time, and then people can apply for those things. And then we can, do that a lot faster. So we already know, what we have, we already know what's eligible, we already know what's out there. Just so folks know, there's a huge supply chain issue going on with all sorts of materials. We'll see how long that lasts, but I think it would be beneficial to this program to kind of do that stuff up front, then people apply for it, and then we can just go right into contracting and people can get those things a lot faster. That's the way I would envision it working.
Okay, thank you.
And a lot of these things we already have on existing MAPC contracts, which we are in the process of identifying that they meet, like Buy America standards and things like that.
Yeah, that was sort of the shadow question was, I know MAPC already has collective procurement, and I'm wondering if, it's sort of leveraging that, what's already there.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of this at the beginning would be leveraging what we already have, including MassDOT, MBTA, and other state procurements for materials.
Okay.
I'm O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm generally supportive of the recommendations in here overall, but a question on the, again, on the transit operating and shuttle programs. As you said, those were sort of a big piece of why we did this program in the first place, was that first mile, last mile connection. So if we were to eliminate the funding of those, what do you see their future being? Where would they fall, or where would they look to get funding in the future?
Yeah, I think that's one of the real challenges, and the instructions that the MPO gave us a couple of years ago when we were rebooting this program from its previous incarnations was to kind of try and figure out a way to fund some of these projects while also ensuring that they would continue to survive past the period of MPO funding, and that they would attract significant local matches and stuff. And I think based on the applications that we've seen a mix, frankly, in terms of how successful the project proponents have been in ensuring financial stability in the future for their projects. So I think one question is, have we met the mission that the MPO laid out for this program a couple of years ago in that regard? And the question is, how important does the MPO think it is that there's a funding source for these projects in the Boston region? Obviously, MassDOT has had programs that have had money available for this at various points. I don't think there's a whole lot out there right now from the MassDOT side. Does the MPO feel it is important to continue to make money available through the MPO, even if the projects that we're seeing are not necessarily fulfilling that criterion of being robust, fiscally sustainable, and attracting lots of riders that we discussed a couple of years ago? And obviously, that is, I guess, the core question that we're asking the MPO at this point. There's also the logistical question of how many of these projects the RTAs would be able and willing to administer.
Okay, just I guess I would just say that I can see what you're saying, but with COVID, a lot of these programs haven't been able to generate ridership because people haven't been going to work. So I don't know if it's too early to make that decision, if we need to give that a little more time.
For sure, and we definitely take that into account.
Thank you.
So before I call on the public, I am going to call on members first, but we will get to the members of the public who want to talk. So I have seen your hands. Jim Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have a couple questions, I think, clarifying questions. So this kind of group procurement would really kind of shift it to a kind of materials, kind of capital cost only program, I'm assuming, and then the applicant will be responsible for actual labor and implementation. Say, for example, you know, a series of bike racks would be, the actual install and labor would be done by the union, right?
And that is actually currently the case as well.
That is the case. Gotcha.
Yeah, right now the program procures the materials and the proponent does the whatever design is necessary and the labor to install.
Gotcha. Okay. And then on the shuttles, I mean, I'm just wondering how interested the RTAs would be in in taking on the administrative burden that I know is difficult with shuttle management. I definitely can see the challenges with the costs of funding them and the recurring costs of them as well. So just wondering if there isn't a way to maybe like we had done a long time ago when there was the TDM program where applicants for shuttle operations had to kind of articulate how they were going to pay for, you know, future years of operations, you know, whether it was through members of the TMA that maybe the shuttle was kind of under. Wondering if that could be a factor to kind of prevent this recurring cost challenge, because obviously we don't want to fund a shuttle service, get it up and running, and then the operator or the entity doesn't have the resources to keep it going. That obviously is bad for everybody. So wondering if there's not a factor to add to that. And I also agree with, you know, maybe it's a dollar limit on total kind of shuttle services, but I kind of would hate to see it completely go away. So I'm wondering if those two pieces couldn't be added. So kind of proof of future year funding once this funding goes away, and then I'm forgetting my other point. Yeah, so just those are, I think, a couple questions and a couple points. Oh yeah, and limiting the total amount of, the shuttle services for the program, I think makes sense.
Thank you. Brian King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to second what Jim Fitz just said around shifting administrative costs to RTAs. Can't speak for RTAs outside of, you know, the T, but having been on the inside of the T, I can suggest that an administrative burden is real, and it's probably not something that would be welcome. So I'll leave that at that. So I guess Sandy and Matt and everybody, this program's been up and running for a couple of years, and I take the point that COVID has made it impossible or difficult to get many of these up and running. Have we certified any of these funded projects to actually have had a air quality benefit? Do we have any evidence of ridership improving or increasing, not just shifting from another mode of public transit? And while I understand the desire that cities and towns have to do this, I also do, again, back what Jim Fitz just said around dollar limits and long-term feasibility of finances. I mean, I remember when I was first on this board 10 odd years ago, there was a shuttle in Acton that had a projected ridership of 3 people per day. You know, that seems a little absurd to me if that's what we're still funding. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, so the only operating project that's been funded through this program that has actually launched is the microtransit in Newton, and they only launched in June or July because of impacts from COVID. So, you know, we have projections as to what the ridership and air quality impact would be, but we haven't seen any ridership data yet that would give us any useful information.
Okay.
Thank you, Sandy.
All right, thanks.
Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question and then a couple of comments. My question relates to, to what Brian said, were you including the MBTA when you were talking about RTAs? I mean, so would the MBTA also be included as someone that could operate a service, or did you really mean just the RTAs?
Oh, we're including the MBTA if they're interested.
Oh, okay, that was the question. Just a couple of points about the CMAQ program. First, we do appreciate that you are taking a hard look at some of these things. We had some questions and concerns, and it's also an administrative burden for Federal Highway to have each of these as separate authorizations and contracts. And so we are not opposed to transferring funds to the MBTA, nor are we opposed to this MAPC stepping up to do some of the purchasing. But with that program, the MassDOT does not have an approved program to certify local public agencies to do federal contracts. And so we would have to talk to MAPC about questions as to, as a subrecipient implementing federal, in effect, construction, we would have to chat about certain requirements that we may have for construction inspections and all kinds of things like that. So Eric, at some point, if it gets to that, we would have to chat. I don't foresee anything that would be insurmountable, but it is something that we would have to talk about. And finally, I just want to talk about the intent of the CMAQ program. The intent of the CMAQ program, particularly for operating funds, is that it is seed money, that there is an expectation that after 3 years, anything that's funded will be able to succeed and be funded through other sources. That is the whole intent of the CMAQ program for operating shuttles and things like that. And so I would suggest that there not be the sole criteria whether there's an air quality benefit to see if the second and third year get funded, but there be a more of a comprehensive evaluation as to whether the service is doing what it said it was going to do, and that there's a probability that it would be able to succeed without this federal CMAQ funding. That is the whole intent of the program. So just the fact, I mean, if a shuttle could say, hey, we expect to get 100 riders per day, we're only getting 20, but there's still an air quality benefit. There is no, it only has to be a tiny air quality benefit. It just has to be positive. There's no magnitude required. But I would venture to say something like that may not fulfill the needs or the requirements of the CMAQ program. So I think you need more criteria than just what is an air quality benefit to determine whether the second and third year of funding is warranted.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. And the application for the CC program does involve an in-depth kind of asking people to project what their funding will look like and for them to show that they will have full capability to fund it locally in year 4. And in fact, some of the applications that we've found to be somewhat weak, the deficiency has been precisely in that, and that we're not confident that it'll be financially sustainable.
Right, and there's just one more thing in terms of data collection. In order to determine whether there's an air quality benefit, I think Brian alluded to this too, it's not just ridership numbers. In order to estimate the air quality benefit, you also need to determine things like formal mode of travel and whether, and things like that. So we have asked that proponents, not only do they submit ridership, but they also do a ridership survey to get the kind of information that would be necessary to determine whether there is an air quality benefit or not. Thank you.
Eric?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Ken, we absolutely should have a meeting, and Sandy, let's work on scheduling that and talk about some of these things. I guess I have a couple thoughts. I mean, over the years, I've been a a big proponent of this program and sort of its predecessors to try to provide, relatively modest funding to try to improve, kind of these first and last mile connections to transit and kind of important destinations and encourage, non-auto modes. I think, a couple thoughts here. One is that, just the combination of that not everything we funded has been super effective, and the administrative burden that's associated with these smaller projects and kind of the things that we have to go through to meet federal requirements, I think casts, some amount of shadow on the program. And I just think all the members should, we should think about that. And again, if it turns out that MAPC, can't play a role in kind of overseeing these procurements and kind of managing some of this stuff, I don't know if that part of this program will then make sense, which casts a big shadow on, I think, whether we can do this or not. So I think that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that the state, has shown an increasing commitment to this shared streets and complete streets program, shared streets being separate, which is also funding some similar type things. And so I think we should keep an eye on that as well when we kind of convene and discuss this. So I just want to, throw a couple things out there. I think this is a good start to the conversation. It's certainly not the end of it. But I think staff have done a really good job here kind of laying out what the issues are.
Yeah, and Sandy, when you set up the meeting with Federal Highway, make sure you invite my staff. Because
absolutely,
we do these contracts currently with other MPOs. We have bike share contracts with Cape Cod and with Pioneer Valley. And I believe what we're envisioning here is something similar. And so we know how to do it. FHWA participates. So just make sure Derek's involved when you have your meeting with Kim.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other MPO members before I start calling on members of the public? Seeing none, Susan Barrett, and thank you for your patience.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to comment. So just commenting on whether or not these transit operating projects should be administered by RTAs. If you do continue to fund these projects, I do believe they should be at least coordinated by the RTAs. So I'm using that word coordinated, after hearing Brian Kane's concern. I do understand administrative burden, but I do think the first stop for any new transit operating projects should be with the RTAs or the MBTA. And the reason for that is for better coordination. I think you're all very well aware that we have, numerous transportation services, but because of different eligibility, just different forms of operating, we just end up with a lot of gaps in service for people. That better coordination could also help with better resource sharing, and I mean that in every sense of the word, from funding to drivers to backup fleets. Better coordination, hopefully, with payment systems and so forth. Additionally, you'd want to make sure, and I think the RTAs would be better suited to look at this, that you aren't just moving people from a traditional fixed route service onto something like a microtransit because microtransit only at best serves about 3 people per vehicle hour. You'd want to make sure that you're better utilizing the fleets that you already have rather than just offering a duplicative and sometimes less efficient service. And then the other point I'll make is that sometimes these new services might be proposed by a municipality or a council on aging, which doesn't always have the same expertise that an RTA might have. So again, even if they're not fully administered by the RTAs, at least having them be the first touch point that can give approval and offer the coordination, I think would be important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Lynn Diggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I held back because I really wanted to hear what Susan had to say, and I'm glad I did. So there's so much here. There's just really a lot. Even I'm having a hard time digesting it. even when I read stuff, that's presented before us before the meeting, I end up often rereading it in order to make sure I understand. So I know we need to make some decisions today, but my request is that maybe we could get something written up that's distributed to us at a later meeting, so that when I have discussions with other people, namely other members of the advisory council, because I certainly want us to discuss this, even if it's post a decision. I can do so in a more intelligible way, and in fact, give it to them to read so that they don't have to go through my translation. So that's a request. Another request is that, once again, this will probably be after the fact, but I know that the MPO has this transit working group, and I don't know to what extent that they have been, members of them have been involved in the decision-making process. And I want to back up and say the fact that so many people that in groups that I respect have been involved in this makes me confident in the proposals. So I'm not objecting to anything. And if we need to move forward, I'm happy to move forward with the recommendations as they've been presented. So a question maybe to Matt and or Sandy. So let's say Arlington came up with a transit program, and it's saying, in 4 years, we're pretty convinced that we can get the town to fund it. But in the first 3 years, we'd like the support, some financial support that comes from this program. Does accepting the recommendations of this prevent us from coming to making that proposal and requesting funding for it?
So I think what we would want to see in that case, for if a municipality is coming and saying we think we can fund it in year 4, is a couple of things. First, that the federal share, as moderated through the MPO, coming to the project is going to go down each year in years 1 through 3, and that local funding sources are explicitly identified, not just, hey, you have our word, but like, this is the fund, or this is the contributor that money is coming from, and here's why we think it is reliable that money is going to be available to be the local match in years 1 through 3, and then to take over funding entirely in year 4. And then what we're discussing, that these projects would need to be administered through RTAs, is the municipality would also need to get the local RTA on board. In the case of Arlington, that would be the MBTA to help with the administrative process.
Or Lexington, maybe. I hear you. Thank you.
So Sandy, can you go back and answer Lynn's question about whether the transit working group, whatever we've actually called it, has been briefed and involved in the discussion to date on this key decision points?
Yeah, we have not done anything with the transit working group with this particular presentation, but we have done multiple updates on the community connections program for them in the past. And I as someone who's been involved in managing the transit working group, I think it would be good to get this on the agenda at some point soon, either as we can do an informal coffee chat, or we can put it on the agenda of the October meeting that we're planning. I do like that idea.
Excellent. Thank you, Sandy. Other questions from the MPO? So seeing none, I'm going to divide these questions in 2. And anybody who objects, please say so. But I've got a general sense from the comments that the MPO is relatively comfortable with bullet 1, assuming that the meeting with Ken and FHWA and MAPC and the MPO staff and my staff goes well. I think there's a general comfort level of, yes, we should try to make this easier for everybody, and thank MAPC and take them up on their offer to help administer the program. I don't think anybody has any concerns with that, assuming it actually can work. Is that correct? All right, so nobody seems to be objecting to that. So I think you've got an answer for bullet 1. Assuming it can go forward and convert that part of the program into what you proposed. Bullet 2, I think there's some level of still concern issues that the MPO would like to talk about again. So I would think, Sandy, that you should take this to the RTA working group in whichever way you deem is appropriate, and then come back and report again, you or Matt or both of you afterwards, and then we can try to address this, because we don't want to say, yes, let's do this only if RTAs are administering it, only to you then go to RTAs and have them say, yeah, we're not interested. So do a little bit more groundwork, homework on this one, and then let's schedule this for a future agenda item sometime as soon as you've had that backup. So hopefully in October, I would think. Does that work for everybody? And does it work for staff too? When I say everybody, I mean you, Sandy, you, Matt, Hagan. Does that work?
Yeah, I think we can absolutely do that. The other question I would have for the MPO is the question of a cap on how many projects or how many dollars would go to operating projects has also been brought up a couple of times here. And would the MPO like us to explore what that might look like? Would it be a cap on dollars? Would it be a cap on number of projects? Would it, we could present different options at the next meeting as well.
I think that would be great. Absolutely. I think you should brief the second bullet and present as much as you think are things that you think we should think about, and try to give you an answer.
Okay, we can do that.
Anybody else have anything else they'd like to see on this subject before we move on to the next agenda item? Seeing none, thank you very much, both of you. It was a very good presentation. Next item is member items. Does any member have an item at this time? If so, please raise your hand. Seeing none, remember we're meeting not on the 16th, but on the 23rd. And if you can't get to the 23rd, please do let staff know. Eric Rossi, you have your hand up. Do you have an item, or are you going to make a motion to adjourn?
I'm so sorry. I just wanted to remind people that at 12 noon, we do have the ad hoc tip cost increase committee. I wanted to remind everyone that will be at 12 noon. We are really looking to make a final recommendation to the full MPO board at this meeting. So I just want to, I hope everyone that's on that committee can participate. And I'm happy to make a motion to adjourn whenever you would like, Mr. Chair.
You can go ahead and make that motion now, Eric, and we'll get out of the way. Time for your 12 o'clock with time to spare.
I will make a motion to adjourn.
Brian Kane.
Second.
Without objection, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much. We'll see you on the 23rd, except those of you who are staying for the 12 o'clock. You guys will get together at 12. Thanks a lot.